The lease is signed, you celebrated, you moved in, business is running. Then 6 years later, one clause in your commercial lease suddenly becomes the most important sentence in the entire document. The problem? Most business owners haven't read their commercial lease since the day they signed it. And today I'm showing you 5 commercial lease clauses that don't seem important until they are. I'm Susan, that commercial realtor. I work with landlords, tenants, buyers, and investors across Southern Ontario. Quick note, I'm a commercial realtor, not a lawyer. This isn't legal advice. It's the knowledge you need to ask the right questions before you sign. So let's get into it. Let's start with the renewal option clause in a commercial lease. The one clause tenants often assume is straightforward. It's common for tenants with renewal options to feel secure. They know they can stay. They know they have the right to renew. What they don't often know is what renew actually means in the language of the lease. And this is where confusion lives. Many renewal options say the space will be renewed at market rent, which sounds reasonable. It can also mean that when renewal time arrives, the rent is not simply continuing from where it left off. It's being reset based upon what the market looks like at that moment, not what you've been paying, not what you were quoted 3 or 5 years ago. It's also worth noting that many renewal options state the new net rent can't be lower than the final year's net rent under the existing lease, even if the market rent has declined. That's another reason it's important to understand exactly how your renewal clause is written. In a market where rents have moved, and in most Canadian markets over the last several years, they sure have, that reset can land very differently than a tenant had expected. Then there's the deadline. Many renewal options require written notice within a defined window, sometimes 6 months before expiry, sometimes 9, sometimes even 12. Miss that window, and in many cases, the option is gone. The landlord isn't obligated to remind you. The responsibility to track that date sits with you, the tenant. Know your notice deadline, written in ink on the calendar, today. Number 2, the exclusivity clause. In a commercial lease, this clause matters most for retail and service businesses, but office and industrial tenants are not immune. An exclusivity clause prevents the landlord from leasing other space in the same property to a direct competitor. The question worth asking is whether your lease has one, because if it doesn't, nothing stops the landlord from leasing the unit next door or down the hall or across the parking lot to a business that competes directly with yours. This is not necessarily bad intent on anyone's part. Landlords are managing buildings with multiple tenants and multiple interests. While landlords would not intentionally lease space to harm an existing tenant, it's important to understand they are not automatically obligated to protect your market position unless the lease says that they are. Exclusivity clauses, when they exist, need to be specific. What business type is excluded? Does it apply to the entire property or only the building? What happens if a tenant's business evolves into something new that now competes with yours? Vague exclusivity language creates as many problems as no exclusivity language. If protecting your position in the building matters to your business, and for many it genuinely does, this is a conversation to have before the lease is signed, not after a competing tenant moves in 2 units away. 3, the permitted use clause, an often overlooked section of commercial leases. This clause defines what you are allowed to do in the space, which sounds simple. In practice, it can be surprisingly narrow. When a lease is signed, the permitted use is usually written to reflect what the tenant is doing at that moment. A retail store selling home goods, a professional service office, a light manufacturing operation producing a specific product. The challenge is that businesses do evolve. The retailer adds a service component. The office adds a training function. The manufacturer adds a product line that requires different equipment or a different operational process. In some cases, those changes fall within the permitted use. In others, they simply don't. And operating outside the permitted use can create real problems under the lease. This isn't about landlords looking for reasons to cause problems. In my experience, landlords want stable, successful tenants. A growing business is usually a good thing for everyone. But if the lease language is narrow and the business has changed significantly, that gap is worth understanding and addressing, ideally in writing with the landlord before it becomes a compliance issue. When reviewing a lease, I always ask clients, where do you see this business in 3 years? The permitted use clause should reflect not just today's operation, but a reasonable version of tomorrow's. Now for number 4, assignment and subletting. Many tenants sign a lease planning to stay for the full term. Life and business don't always cooperate. A business gets sold, a company expands or changes direction and use significantly. A market changes and relocation becomes necessary. When that happens, the assignment and subletting clause becomes one of the most important sections in your lease. Assignment means transferring the lease to another party entirely, typically as part of a business sale. Subletting means leasing part or all of the space to another tenant while you retain the lease obligations. Commercial leases generally require landlord consent for both. What varies significantly is what that consent process looks like. Some leases give landlords broad discretion. Some specify that consent cannot be unreasonably withheld. Some outline exactly what information the landlord can request and how long they have to respond. Some give the landlord the right to terminate the lease and deal with the incoming tenant directly, rather than consenting to the assignment. If that last one surprised you, chances are excellent it's in your lease too. The time to understand your flexibility and limitations is before you sign, not when you're trying to sell your business and discover the lease structure is complicating the transaction. If there's any possibility your business could be sold, transferred, or significantly restructured during the lease term, this clause deserves a careful read before you commit. And finally, TMI in a commercial lease and what counts as capital expenditure. If you've seen my video on TMI, you know that taxes, maintenance, and insurance are the operating costs of the building passed through the tenants based on their proportionate share of the space. Tenants generally understand the concept. What many don't look closely at is the line between ongoing maintenance costs, which are typically recoverable through TMI, and capital expenditures, which is a different category entirely. For clarity, here's the distinction in plain language. Ongoing maintenance is the regular cost of keeping a building operating. Snow removal, landscaping, repairs to common areas, routine upkeep. Capital expenditures are major investments in the building. A new roof, replaced HVAC system, a repaved parking lot, a significant structural repair. The question that matters most is, under your specific lease, are any capital expenditures recoverable from tenants? Because while some leases exclude capital expenditures from TMI entirely, some allow certain capital costs to be recovered, often amortized over a number of years, and some are less clear than either of those. The difference between what's included and what isn't can have a real impact on your occupancy cost over a multi-year lease term. Reviewing the specific language in your lease and understanding exactly what is and isn't recoverable is a conversation to have with a commercial real estate lawyer before you sign. Clarity up front is always easier than questions after the fact. Here's the thread connecting all 5 of these clauses. None of them are unusual. None of them are buried. They're in commercial leases everywhere across Canada, from Halifax to Vancouver. What they have in common is that they don't feel urgent at signing. The renewal feels far away, the exclusivity feels theoretical, the permitted use feels obvious, the assignment feels unlikely, and the TMI feels like fine print. By the time any one of them becomes urgent, the lease is already signed and the options available to you are shaped entirely by what that document says. The tenants I see navigating commercial real estate most successfully aren't always the ones with the most experience. They're the ones who asked the right questions before they signed. A commercial lease is a long-term commitment. The rental rate matters, the TMI matters, the location matters, so does understanding what you're agreeing to on every page, not just the ones with the numbers. Before you sign, work with a commercial realtor who knows the market and a commercial real estate lawyer who knows the language. That combination is what turns a lease into a foundation instead of a liability. Subscribe for practical commercial real estate advice, whether you're signing your first lease, negotiating a renewal, or trying to understand what's actually in that document. Like this video if you learn something new. Save it before you sign your next commercial lease. I'm Susan, that commercial realtor, built for business, backed by data, negotiating with bite. Now that you know what's inside those pages nobody reads, what are you going to do about it?